So every single summer, my family and I, we try and make a point to take a week out of our summer and just spend it together. And this summer, we got to go to Kirkland, Idaho, which is really close to Spokane, and we spent the whole week together. And it was super fun, the weather was great, but my favorite part was that we got to go on this bike trail, and it's called the Hiawatha Bike Trail. It's about 15 miles each way, and I really enjoy riding my bike, so I was super stoked to be able to do this. But the thing about this bike trail is there's tunnels all the way through. The longest one's about 2 miles long, and that might not sound like a long time, or like a lot of miles, but it is a long time, because the thing about the tunnels is that they're pitch black. You literally cannot see a thing as you're riding through. And not only are they so dark, they're freezing inside. So I remember it was like 90 degrees outside, and you go in this tunnel and you're just freezing. But you literally cannot see anything in front of you. You have to wear a headlamp on your helmet, and that only shows like a foot in front of you. But I was with my parents and my boyfriend Derek, and as soon as we entered in, we literally just lost each other. So I'm like, all right, I'm by myself, I got my headlamp, I'm going to be great, until I get just enough far through where there's no more light left and my headlamp goes out. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I literally can't even see the bike I'm riding anymore. I'm thinking, I'm going to crash, no one's going to know where I am because it's pitch black, and I will die of hypothermia in this freezing cold tunnel. But I'm having this little panic attack, and I just think, okay, I can just keep riding through, I can make it through this long stretch of darkness, and I eventually did. I have no idea how, because I could not see a thing, until I literally saw a light at the end of the tunnel, until I literally saw the daylight. And it was great, but that was a long stretch of time for me to ride through darkness, not knowing what was going on. And I was thinking about this story, and I was also thinking about how sometimes in life there's these long stretches of darkness where we can't see what God is doing, or we have no idea what's going on, we can't make sense of what's going on around us, and during those times it's really hard to believe that God is working at all, let alone that He's working for our good. But He is, and so the title of my sermon today is called God Works in the Dark, and we're specifically going to look at how God worked in the darkness of Abraham's life. God promised Abraham some huge things, specifically 3 giant things that Abraham couldn't see them being fulfilled even in his lifetime for a lot of it. And it was dark, but God still worked through the midst of that. God worked through the midst of Abraham's unfulfilled promises. And Abraham's story is told in Genesis 12 through 25. You're welcome to turn there with me if you'd like. We're just going to skim through a lot of the text though. But Abraham was 75 years old when God called him to leave his home and go to a land that I will show you. So Abe packed up all his belongings, gathered his family, and set out for this land. The 3 promises that God promised to Abraham was 1, a land, 2, many offspring, and 3, that he would be a blessing. God's first promise to Abraham, it says in verse 12, was lift up your eyes and look north and south, east and west, and all the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. The second thing he promised Abraham in Genesis 15:5 was many offspring. It says that the Lord then took Abraham outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. God told Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. And then God even changed his name from Abram, which meant exalted father, to Abraham, which means father of many. The third promise that God promised to Abraham was to make him a blessing. God told Abraham that all of the nations on the earth would be blessed and benefited through his offspring. These were 3 promises that God so clearly promised to Abraham. And he lived to be 175 years old, and he lived the last 100 years of his life in hope of these 3 promises. And this is what happened. For the first promise, a land, for 100 years, Abraham lived in Canaan, the land that God promised to give him. And when he died at 175 years old, how much of Canaan did Abraham own? He owned 1 cave. He owned 1 small cave that he ended up burying his wife Sarah, and where he was buried when he died too. That's all. For 100 years, he had no permanent dwelling. He was a nomad in the Promised Land, and the Bible says that he was living out of tents and saddlebags that entire time. So here's Abraham, and God promises him that he's going to have this entire land, and he only has one cave, and he's living out of suitcases pretty much. And I remember it was always my parents' dream to build a house growing up. So since I can remember, they saved up so much money. And when I was in 8th grade, they finally had enough. And they started building this house, and everything was going great until we ended up running out of money. And we had to sell our current house before the other house was finished. And so we had nowhere to live, and what we had to do was borrow a trailer from a friend and live on the property of this unfinished house for 3 months. And I remember how badly it sucked. Living out of suitcases is not fun. I didn't know where anything was at all, anytime. I only had one suitcase. Everything is packed away. It's the worst. And Abraham and Sarah did this for 100 years. I cannot imagine doing that for 100 years, moving around from place to place all the time. And I can just hear this conversation between Sarah and Abraham, husband and wife. I can hear Sarah saying, "Abe, when are we going to get a place of our own?" And Abraham's like, "Well, honey, any day now. God promised us this land." And Sarah's like, "I've been hearing that for 83 years. I'm sick of hearing that. I'm sick of living out of suitcases. When is God going to stop promising and start producing?" I'm sure that both of them would have liked to see it in their lifetime. But neither Abraham or Sarah did see it in their lifetime. The Bible says that they died without seeing this promise come true. They died and were buried in their one cave. But they died still trusting in the one who promised. And God made good on his promise later on to Abraham's offspring. But you got to know that there had to be lots of times when Abraham and Sarah wondered, what in the world is God up to? Every time they packed and unpacked their suitcases again, they had to wonder, where is God's promise? The second thing that God promised Abraham was many offspring. And this is also a funny story because Abraham was 75 already. Sarah was 65 when God first gave them this promise before they had any children. Now 75 and 65 aren't exactly prime childbearing years, and God was already behind schedule when he gave this promise. But after he gave this promise, another 24 years go by. Abraham is now 99 years old. Sarah is 89. And I can bet you that pregnancy was the very last thing on their minds. But then God shows up and is like, "Hey, remember that promise? It's time now." And the Bible says that Abe laughed. And I love what he says. It says that he was like, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." And Ishmael was Abraham's son by Hagar, who was Sarah's maid. And Abraham was basically saying, in case you hadn't noticed, Sarah's getting a little old for this, and Lord, I think you just missed your chance. Why don't we just go with Ishmael, stick to plan B here? That's not exactly showing great faith towards God's promise. When Sarah heard, she also just fell down and laughed. But God still keeps his promise, and Sarah gets pregnant and has a baby, which is Isaac, and that means laughter. And then God says, "Your offspring will be numbered through Isaac." So years later, when Abraham and Sarah die, they have one cave in the land, and what have they got for kids? They have one kid. They don't have nations, they don't have millions like the stars in the sand. They have one, uno. Don't you think that there had to have been many times throughout that 100 years when they wondered, "Hey, what about these kids, Lord? You said that there were going to be as many as sand, as stars in the sky. What about this many offspring? What about your promise?" They only ended up with one kid. But they still kept trusting God even when it didn't make sense. The third promise was that Abraham would be made a blessing. And Abraham dies at 175 with one cave, one kid, and a promise that the whole world would be blessed through him. Can you imagine what Abraham must have thought? Well, promises 1 and 2 didn't turn out that great, so how in the world, God, are you going to pull off promise number 3? But God did, because it was through the line of Abraham that God brought his son Jesus into the world, and Jesus brought all mankind back to himself. This was God's plan all along. Abraham, like us so much, saw so little. He only saw his small, short life, but God saw the big picture. This third promise wasn't fulfilled until about 1,500 years after Abraham had died. The truth is that God's redemptive purposes are worked out on his schedule. Sometimes it takes months, years, 1,500 years in the case of Abraham. But you got to give God time, and that was true of God's promises to Abraham. And I was going through this story and doing all my research on Abraham and Sarah. I started to think again about my aunt and uncle. Kind of like Abraham and Sarah, they had felt like God had promised them a family, that having kids was just in the cards for them. So after about 3 years of being married, they started to try to have kids, and they just couldn't get pregnant. And so they go to the doctor and to get some tests done. And my uncle tells the story the best. He says that after the tests were done, the doctor comes up to him and puts his arm around his shoulder and was like, "Matt, how do you feel about adoption? Because you're not going to get pregnant anytime soon." And he thinks he's so funny because he was like, "Well, I know I'm not going to get pregnant, but what about Heidi?" I don't think it's that funny, but I thought I would throw that in there because he thinks he's hilarious. But they started pursuing adoption, and they ended up being able to adopt like 2 babies within 2 years, and it was great. But they were still so sad that they couldn't have their own. But then about 4 years after they learned that they couldn't get pregnant, my aunt suddenly got pregnant with twins. And it was like this huge miracle. God's promise had literally come through. It was a miracle. But they'll be honest and say that there were times where it was hard on their marriage, where they would stay up at night crying because they couldn't have their own babies. They couldn't understand why in the world they felt like God had promised them this and it wasn't coming true. But they couldn't see that God was still working through that darkness. Who knows, maybe they wouldn't have ever adopted those 2 kids if they got pregnant right off the bat. God had a plan for them the entire time. He was constantly working through that darkness, even though they had no idea and they couldn't see it. And I think that it's stories like my uncle and aunts and even Abraham and Sarah's that I definitely need to rely on right now in my life, because I'm walking through some huge darkness. My church is walking through some incredible darkness. I've been interning at Maltby for 2.5 years now, and I absolutely love it. But recently, one of the kids that has been attending our youth group for a while killed himself. And it's been like seriously devastating, especially as a leadership team. And the kids that are there that were all friends with him. And it's one of those things where it's so confusing. We literally had no idea. We would have never suspected. And his small group leaders are just at a loss for anything. And it's complete darkness. It's like, God, where are you in this situation? How could anything good even ever come from this? But we're believing, and I'm believing, that God is at work in this darkness right now. We can't see it, and we don't know what he's doing. But either did my aunt and uncle, and either did Abraham and Sarah. And I can still believe that he's working through our good, and even more importantly, he's working redemptively. I know that somehow God is going to use all these situations to further his redemptive purposes and to bring people back to himself. I know that God is working through this darkness, and that's just what I have to trust in this time. And I know that I probably don't even have to ask you guys if you're walking through darkness right now, because I know you probably are. And I just want to encourage you today that God is working in your darkness, that he is there. And I can promise you that even if you can't see God right now, I know for a fact that he sees you. So, thank you.